with our next panel. So we're going to continue discussing community and sector-based perspectives on cascading drought impacts. For this session, we have 4 panelists joining us, and I'll go ahead and briefly introduce them before I turn it over to them. Kevin Moran is the director of the State and Federal Water Policy Advocacy for Environmental Defense Fund's Resilient Water Systems Program. Chris Perkins is the senior director at the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable, which is America's leading coalition of outdoor recreation trade associations and organizations. We also have Jesse Bell, who is a professor of water, climate, and health in the Department of Environmental, Agricultural, and Occupational Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, as well as the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And then to round it out, we have Bill Hazenkamp, who is the manager of Colorado River Resources for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. So I will first turn it over to Kevin Moran. And for the rest of you, if you'd like to turn your cameras off, you can, and thank you. Thanks, go ahead, Kevin.
Thanks very much. It's an honor to be with you all today and to learn from so many experts. We who live in the West know that we're facing interconnected crises of wildfire, extreme heat, and drought. The climate crisis is hitting home. We're far beyond the place where it was once an academic discussion about future impacts. The climate crisis is disrupting lives, homes, and livelihoods for millions of people in the West and in the world. Human-caused climate change is increasing drought risk across much of the United States as rising temperatures accelerate evaporation, increase water uptake by heat-parched plants, and reduce the amount of water that's produced by snowpack and runoff for the dry summer months. We all know that flows in the Colorado River have declined about 20% from historical averages since 2000, and about half of that decline is attributable to a warming climate. And scientists are telling us we probably ought to be preparing for an additional decline in river flows of 14 to 31% by 2050. I would be remiss if I didn't say up front, before getting into other strategies and issues, we must reduce as much greenhouse gases globally as fast as possible, or the probability of increasingly bad outcomes for people and nature in the region and the world will continue to increase. The viability, indeed, of water and land management strategies that we'll talk about here depend on bold and comprehensive action on climate. Next slide, please. Now, the effects of drought, actually, can we go back to the last one? Sorry. Reverse, please, thank you. The effects of drought on the environment are compounding. It's visible on the surface. We can see lake levels declining like those of Lake Mead here, and we can see flows in rivers and streams diminishing. As surface water becomes less available, reliance on groundwater tends to increase, causing many domestic and agricultural wells to go dry. In combination with warmer temperatures, this trend can be devastating to groundwater-dependent ecosystems that are so vital to wildlife in the arid Southwest. Next slide. Now, many basins in the West are suffering due to extended severe drought. The Colorado River is acutely aware of drought impacts, as you've heard already from several speakers. We're currently in the midst of a 20-year drought in most of the basin, and some are now using the term aridification, which has been debated already this morning on what it means and how to understand it. One fact, though, is that normal snowpack, what we might think of as normal snowpack, is not yielding as much water in rivers as was true before. For example, in 2020, snowpack was 114% of historical average, but runoff was in the 55% of historical average range. Now, these obviously these conditions have a huge impact on rivers and streams. Last summer, Colorado state agencies temporarily asked anglers to stop fishing parts of the Colorado River. We know that warm water temperatures threaten the health of fish and this important part of our recreational economy. On the Hopi tribe's lands in northeastern Arizona, drought has contributed to declining levels in a sacred spring where the tribe has practiced religious ceremonies for hundreds of years. Forests, of course, as we're seeing so vividly and painfully every day in the West, are susceptible to catastrophic fires. In 2020, Colorado saw the 3 largest wildfires in the state's history. In Arizona, over the past 3 years, wildfires have consumed more than 500,000 acres, or nearly 1,000 square miles. Drought makes wildfires more likely, and those fires that start burn at higher temperatures and spread rapidly. Next slide. We need transformational change in the region and in water management generally, in mindset and actions, in order to ensure water security and resilience for people and nature. First, we have to plan for the river that scientists tell us we're going to have, not the one that many of us remember or the one we might wish for. This means that modeling of future hydrology and water supplies, which is the basis of agreements and plans and so much that's important in the basin, they must be realistic. Second, we must begin at a bigger scale to address long-standing inequities. Residents of Navajo Nation, for example, are 67 times more likely to live without running water than other Americans. And at least 1 in 3 homes on Navajo Nation do not have running water. I would commend to you the work of the Water and Tribes Initiative and a proposal for universal clean access to water for Native Americans. Third, we need to take an all of the above, or some people call it a whole portfolio approach. Plan for reductions in water use across all sectors, major investments in recycling and reuse, resilience investments, and deciding what we mean by resilience and what outcomes we're going for. Better groundwater management. Climate smart agriculture will be critically important. It must work for rural communities and augmentation. Now, EDF, next slide, please. EDF and partners have created a report, 10 strategies for climate resilience in the Colorado River Basin. We think these strategies are worthy of further investigation, testing, and scaling up the ones that provide provable benefits to prepare the basin for a drier water future. These strategies are part of a holistic, basin-wide approach to climate adaptation for water security and other benefits. For example, farmers in central Arizona are among the first to lose Colorado River supplies during the shortage that will be happening next year. EDF and partners are working with multinational tire company Bridgestone and a Pinal County, Arizona farmer on a crop switching demonstration project. Waiuli, a natural source of rubber, requires about half the water of other crops grown in the region, including alfalfa. Crops like Waiuli can be part of a solution to the region's challenges by reducing water demand while maintaining a vibrant agricultural economy. Next slide, please. We need to upgrade our aging infrastructure in agriculture so that we can use water more efficiently. And we also need to invest at a much bigger scale in our natural infrastructure and strategies on the ground that producers want to use. This includes managing our forests to increase water storage and reduce wildfire risk, utilizing dry stream beds, for example, to recharge water into aquifers while creating habitat. And we can do a lot more to incentivize climate resilient agricultural practices like the ones utilized by the Knott family, who you see here on their ranch in Colorado's Yampa River Valley. The Knott family creates grazing systems that retain winter moisture and fire breaks to mitigate damage from potential wildfire. We all know that federal policy changes and funding are essential. The bipartisan infrastructure bill authorizes new funding for drought response and resilience in several important categories. $250 million for the DCP implementation that you heard Deanna talk about, $3.2 billion for tribal water projects, $2.1 billion for forest restoration, and at least $200 million for watershed health and natural infrastructure. And I would also mention that the Western Water Infrastructure Coalition, joined by EDF, Drought Unlimited, and others, is urging that we do even more in other federal legislation, including the reconciliation bill now under development, with a focus on achieving durable and quantifiable watershed resilience outcomes. Next slide, please.
Pardon the interruption. You have 2 minutes.
Very good. I'll come in on time. The stakes could not be greater for our region and our world. I think so many of us in the region can talk about our own stories of the drying land and drought and its impact on our lives at home. In the Colorado River Basin, we must evolve rapidly from a focus on managing water supplies in temporary dry periods to a mindset of managing in a permanently drier climate, which is likely. Both the pace and scale of the basin's collaborative water agreements and plans must increase. We need major investments in the health of natural systems to avoid a future of insecure communities, failing economies, and parched ecosystems. Our challenge is really a manifestation of the global question confronting our species. Can we adapt fast enough and in smart ways to the climate crisis to maintain human civilization as we've known it? Thank you. I look forward to the dialogue.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Another great presentation, lots of opportunity for further discussion. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Perkins.
Thank you, and thank you, Kevin, for that presentation. I particularly enjoyed the slide on strategies for climate resilience. That was new to me. So I was once told that you have to establish your credibility as an expert in advance of a presentation. So here I submit some content from my trip over the last few weeks down the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. You can press play on the video. I understand that the video will not have sound, so I can hopefully provide some sound effects myself. That's my ant in the front left, just getting totally demolished by the waves in Horn Creek Rapid. It was a fantastic trip, and it showed me firsthand the power of the Colorado River. But as those of you watching likely know, it's a deceiving video because the river is dammed at the top by the Glen Canyon Dam and the bottom by the Hoover Dam, and they're releasing water to generate recreational flows year round and also to generate energy. So it gives the impression that there is tons of water in the Colorado River when in fact, as we know, its supplies are quite threatened. Next slide, please. So I just want to start by level setting about what we mean when we talk about the outdoor recreation economy. This is an economy that covers a huge diversity of activities from human-powered recreation, so like hiking and biking and skiing and climbing, to hunting and angling, as well as motorized use, so like RVs and ATVs and snowmobiles. All of these activities are highly popular in the Southwest. You can advance the slide to show the graphic. It's not just the recreationists themselves that comprise the industry. It's all the stakeholders that have a vested interest in outdoor recreation. So looking at the private sector, you have manufacturing and retail businesses, as well as guides and outfitters. In the public sector, you have community economic development groups, tribal nations, local, state, and federal agencies. And then in the nonprofit sector, you have community groups, service corps, and advocacy and trade associations. Next slide, please. And so when you look at this collection of stakeholders, you might suspect that this industry contributes massive economic value to the United States, and the data does support that. What you're seeing here is courtesy of the Outdoor Recreation Satellite account at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which shows that outdoor recreation accounts for 5.2 million jobs across the United States. This is 3.3% of all employment, generates $788 billion in real annual gross output, and contributes to 2.1% of the United States GDP. And just to put this in perspective, this economic contribution is larger than oil and gas and mining combined. Next slide, please. And so I work for the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable, which is a collection of 34 trade associations across the outdoor industry, representing more than 110,000 businesses, and really the full diversity of outdoor recreation, the human-powered, the hook and bullet, and the motorized groups. Next slide. So if you take away nothing else from this presentation, I hope that you hold on to these two things. First is that climate change and its impacts are impacting both supply and demand for outdoor recreation amenities, particularly in the Southwest. And the outdoor recreation industry is a huge driver for the economy of the Southwest. And without significant intervention, we'll see widespread economic and cultural impacts, some of which have already started to occur. Next slide, and you can sort of click through the animations on that one. So I live in the West. I live up in Victor, Idaho, and it's hard to ignore all the headlines that have come across my desk this summer about the relationship between climate change and outdoor recreation opportunities, and quite stark impacts. Entire national forest systems closing, air quality at one point in South Lake Tahoe was in the 400 to 500 range, if not higher. I think I read somewhere that Denver at one point in the last few weeks had the 5th worst air quality in the world. We're seeing climate change today, and it's impacting outdoor recreation as we know it. You can go to the next slide. And so as I mentioned in the key takeaways, outdoor recreation, climate change is impacting both supply and demand for outdoor recreation. So you have this convergence of businesses who are unable to operate and consumers who are changing their habits. In the picture in the bottom left, you see certain recreational sites are inaccessible due to declining water levels. That's the boat ramp at the top of the photo there that clearly couldn't be used by a motorized boat. It's putting habitat stress on game and fish, and shorter winter seasons is impacting the supply chain for outdoor gear and apparel manufacturers. And also, as I've mentioned, demand is changing. This is a photo from just down the road for me of the Tetons, where the air quality has been quite poor this summer. Folks are having to choose between high quality outdoor recreation and their health, and we hate to see that. And smoke is obscuring view sheds and iconic places and changing people's travel habits. And I just wanted to illustrate with a few just really stark anecdotes. Yellowstone National Park at points this summer closed fishing in rivers and streams from 2 p.m. to sunrise as a result of overheated lakes, streams, and rivers to protect the fish. As has probably been covered in this forum already, Lake Powell's around 38% down, which is a full 68 feet below a full reservoir. And to illustrate what this means, well, there's one dock system on Lake Powell that has anchors which are not built for low water, and those anchors had to be moved deeper. And for this reason, around 25 people lost their jobs about 6 weeks earlier than normal, and the marinas lost about 25% of their revenue for the year. So in these very acute ways, we're seeing recreational opportunities impacted around the United States. You can go to the next slide. And the economic consequences of these climate-induced outdoor recreation impacts are significant. So pulling from the same Bureau of Economic Analysis account, you can see here the percentage share of GDP in Southwestern states contributed to by outdoor recreation, and in particular the Colorado River and its associated economic activities related to outdoor recreation are worth about $30 billion in economic expenditures. Next slide. And looking at the local level in rural communities, this has a major impact on rural livelihoods. A number of Southwestern communities have experienced declines in other major extractive industries and turned to outdoor recreation for economic stability for the following reasons. Outdoor rec increases visitation and economic activity, improves public health and healthcare savings, and increases property tax or property value and tax revenues. It brings in new residents, etc. But if your outdoor recreation amenities are no longer high quality or accessible due to climate change, your community's viability is at risk. Next slide, please. So I wanted to conclude by just talking about how the outdoor rec industry is taking on this challenge. Ultimately, it's going to be the energy and transportation sector that has the most impact on climate change in the United States, but we know as an industry that our long-term sustainability relies on healthy public lands and waters, so we're actively working on a number of initiatives. One is just protecting public lands and waters for their biodiversity, for their carbon sink, and other various natural solution benefits. So through the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act last summer, we're putting billions of dollars into public lands and waters and the infrastructure that supports them, and helping build more climate resilient infrastructure. And we're also talking about the proliferation or the need for proliferation of electric charging stations on public lands. As you may know, most public land and water recreation areas don't have great electric charging infrastructure, and we don't want recreationists to have to choose between buying an electric vehicle and maintaining their recreation habits because they're not sure if they can charge their vehicle at their favorite places. So we're trying to advance electric charging across public lands and waters. We also need to be thinking about tax credits for technologies like e-bikes that enable low carbon transport, but can be financially unattainable for low income communities. And we're excited to see that a proposal has been advanced in Congress in recent days as part of the reconciliation deal that would offer billions of dollars in tax credits for e-bike purchases. And finally,
oh, I'm just going to give you the 2-minute time. Okay, go ahead.
Cool. Here's my last point, and this is one that's quite important to me. We believe really strongly that people need to experience the outdoors and develop connections with it in order to be its future advocates. And this comes from building a more diverse and inclusive outdoor industry and outdoor workforce. And this includes proposals like the Civilian Climate Corps, which would engage millions of young people and veterans on green and blue infrastructure projects, including those which benefit outdoor recreation. So next slide. Just to recap, climate change is having major impacts on both supply and demand for outdoor rec amenities. And because of this, a major driver of the Southwest's economy is at stake. I look forward to your questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Chris. Great presentation. I'm going to hand it over now to Jesse Bell.
All right, well, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk about the impacts of drought on human health, especially in the southwestern part of the United States. Typically, when you think of drought, you might not necessarily think of human health or public health impacts, but maybe you're thinking more in the context of agriculture or water resources. But as we've heard from some of the other speakers today, there's a variety of other impacts that can potentially be related back to our health in a variety of different ways. Internationally, we know that droughts have likely caused more deaths than any other climate or weather-related disaster over the last century. Here in the United States, we're still trying to understand some of those pathways to human health outcomes. And so there's still a lot of work that still needs to be done here in the US. But those pathways do exist and the health impacts are occurring. One of the things that makes it difficult for us to understand the impacts of drought compared to other natural disasters or climate-related disasters is that drought is more slow evolving. And so the impacts are not immediate and typically are more delayed or indirect health outcomes, unlike what you would see with a hurricane or a flood, where you see those impacts immediately and it's causing impacts within the community, but also causing impacts that are sending people to the hospital or even potentially causing deaths. And so the way that I think of it is drought changes the environment around us. And those changes in the environment can actually be quite significant and long lasting and very impactful. And those changes then can lead to human health outcomes. And so drought really acts as a threat multiplier when we're talking about human health. Drought can intensify heat waves. It can change the frequency and intensity of wildfires. It can reduce water quality and quantity. It can reduce air quality. It can change vector and wildlife habitat, which then could potentially be related back to the spreading of disease. And as you can see, each of these has a potential relationship with human health, and each of these is directly related to drought in some capacity. Next slide, please. And so I put this figure up here to really illustrate how we get from a drought event to human health outcomes. And so over on the far left, you have different drought types. And when a drought occurs, as I've mentioned, it changes the environment in a variety of different ways. Here are listed out all the different ways that it can potentially change it. And then over on the far right, here are some of the potential health outcomes that can occur because of those changes in the environment. And so that's a pretty linear pathway. But it should be noted that it's not only just that drought occurs, like any other disaster. It's not that it, if it occurs, that you'll see health outcomes. It's really dependent upon where it occurs, when it occurs, and who's it potentially impacting. And so that's where we really have to understand the environmental and institutional context and the social and behavioral context of the communities that we serve and the potential places that are potentially being impacted in some way. Environmental institutional context is basically your infrastructure. It's the environment or land use management practices around the community that you serve. The social and behavioral context is really the individuals that live within that community or live within that impacted area. And so, what are the social determinants of health, occupation? Are they more rural or urban populations? What is the race, literacy, and age? What is dependency on caregivers or pre-existing health conditions that are existing within that population? And so that's how, when we have a drought event, we can either see an increase in potential human health outcomes or a reduction or lower levels of human health outcomes. Next slide, please. And so we know that drought is impacting human health here in the United States. There's a variety of different studies that have shown this and a variety of different relationships that have shown this as well. There was a study that came out a few years ago that showed in the western part of the United States, and specifically, that there were higher rates of mortality and hospitalizations associated with drought events, especially with populations above 65 years of age, because those populations were more at risk or more vulnerable to drought events. And so I'm doing research and other folks are doing research as well to try to better understand what are some of these causes, what are some of these pathways, and why is it that certain populations are more vulnerable or more at risk? And there's a variety of different reasons for that. And I'll get at some of that with some of these examples that I have here. So we know across the United States that heat waves likely cause more deaths than any other climate or weather-related disaster. Internationally, it's droughts, famine, and malnutrition. US, it's heat waves. And one of the things that we know is that drought can potentially intensify heat waves. And so that can lead to a human health outcome. And we know that that's very a prominent issue in the southwestern part of the United States. Last year in 2020 was a record year for Arizona as far as heat-related deaths is concerned. There were around 500 heat-related deaths in the state, and that was a record year for them. And also, it changes water quality and water availability. We've heard some other individuals talking about especially the impact on private domestic wells. That's a major concern. With some of the work that we've been doing, we've had communication with public health officials across the country, and one of the things that keeps coming up is their concern around private domestic wells. As many of you are probably aware, private domestic wells are not regulated by the EPA Safe Water Drinking Act, so they do not have to fall into the same standards that municipal water sources need to abide by. And so one of the things that we know is that changes in climate, especially during drought events, there can be potential changes in water availability, which is obviously of major concern, but also water quality. And there was a study that came out of the USGS earlier this year that showed that during drought events, you actually see higher elevated levels of arsenic in domestic private wells compared to non-drought years. And so that's one more additional threat that people have to be aware of, especially if their water is not being regularly tested. That's something that potentially needs to be communicated to those individuals. They're in the middle of a drought, that maybe that's the time to be testing their water source to see if it's potentially being contaminated. Next slide, please.
Hey, Jesse, this is your 3-minute mark.
Okay.
Yep.
And reduction of air quality is another big issue that we have, obviously because of because of wildfires, but also because of dust. We know that there's an increase in dust storm activity in the southwestern part of the United States. That can cause respiratory ailment, but also it causes issues with traffic accidents because of impairment of visibility along roads. And then in addition, there's a fungal pathogen. It's in the southwest part of the United States. It's been associated with dryness. And so as soils dry in the southwest part of the US, those soils have a naturally occurring fungal pathogen known as Coccidioidomycosis, which is also known as valley fever. When that fungus gets up because of disturbance, when that fungus gets up in the air, you can breathe it in and it can cause respiratory ailments. Next slide, please. And then the other big issue is the impacts on mental health. Internationally, Australia, India, and Africa have all done work around understanding these impacts. We also know here in the United States that agricultural workers and farmers have higher than the average rate of suicide. And there was also a study that was done with some of my colleagues at Minnesota and Iowa that showed during drought events, there was an increased reporting of psychosocial stress in farmers associated with a major drought event that occurred in the central part of the United States. And so that's one more pathway that we're concerned about when we're talking about the impacts of drought on human health and the complexity of some of these relationships as well. Next slide, please. And so lastly, one of the things that I want to address is there are a number of resources that are already available. Even though that we're not thinking of drought in the context of human health, a lot of times when we're talking about it, CDC and other individuals out there are already kind of building the stage for understanding some of these relationships and providing resources to public health officials. And so there's things like the website from CDC around drought and health. NIDIS also has a drought and health website as well. Next slide, please, or next pop-up. And then there's also the development of fact sheets. And then next slide, please. And then also guidance documents as well. And then hit it 2 more times. And one of the other things that we're working on right now, and this is being funded and partnered with NIDIS, is around drought and health and trying to understand the impacts of drought and human health here in the United States. We're hosting regional workshops around the US, and we're also interviewing public health officials around the US as well to try and understand what are they seeing when drought events occur, how are they responding to it, and what is the gaps in knowledge around some of these issues as well, so that they can, our hope is that we can gather this information to help them better respond and prepare for the next drought events that occur, especially for the human health and public health consequences of these events. And so there's still a lot of really good work to happen, and there's a lot of really good opportunities to try to better understand some of these issues associated with public health and human health in the context of drought. And one of the things that I really want to try to advocate for is when we're having these types of meetings, as was here today, is making sure that public health officials are potentially involved in some capacity so that we can have better preparedness and planning around some of these issues as well. And so with that, I'll go to my last slide. And I just wanted to say thank you very much. And if you have any questions or comments, I'll be happy to address those, or feel free to reach out to me afterwards as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jesse. And finally, to round out this panel, let's hear from Bill Hazenkamp.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I have to admit that Chris set the bar high, and that's not my first slide. So go to the first slide. But Chris set the bar high by having to prove that you are one more back. There we go. Thank you. Having to prove you're an expert, since my agency is the largest provider of drinking water in the nation, I guess the only way to demonstrate my expertise is by drinking our final product. And yes, it does taste good. Now the next slide, please. Next slide. think I'm a little out of order. Next slide. There we go. Stop there. So I live in Southern California, and our region is the most variable, has the most variable precipitation in all of the continental United States. The coefficient of variation is shown here on the graph, and Southern California is the epicenter of that variation. What does that mean? It means it never rains in Southern California, but it pours, man, it pours. Our region gets about the same annual precipitation as Denver or Salt Lake City, but our variation is much higher. You heard in the trivia question, Nevada's lowest and highest amount over the last 30 years was 5,000, 5 inches and 15 inches, about a 3 times range in precipitation. In Los Angeles, in the last 20 years, we've had a low of 3 inches and a high of 36 inches. So 12 times difference between the lowest and the highest. And as a result, that makes it very difficult to have a reliable water supplies in our own region. Coupled with a lack of any significant river, we needed to go out of our region to have a reliable water supply. So now go backwards one, because I messed up in the slide. So go back one slide. There we go. So Southern California, in order to be reliable, reached out to 3 different rivers over the years. First, the city of LA built the Los Angeles Aqueduct and tapped the Owens River to bring water to Southern California. Then 100 years ago, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California was formed to bring in water from the Colorado River. And then finally, the State Water Project, the largest water project in the nation at the time, was built in the 1960s, and half of the water from the Sacramento River comes into Southern California. So we have a variety of sources coming in. We have 3 watersheds plus our own local watershed, and that has been very successful to us, because typically one watershed might not be as dry as another. So a drought hasn't affected, or historically didn't affect, all watersheds equally. So if we had a wet year on the Sacramento River, we could take more water from the river and leave more water in the Colorado River and prop up Lake Mead. Likewise, if it was dry in Northern California, we would take more in the Colorado River. So it was a connected system based on the hydrology in each of those regions. Okay, now 2 slides ahead, please. Apologize for that mix-up. But as we've heard, as we've seen earlier, California in the last 12 months has been both the hottest the hottest year ever in 125 years of data, and the driest year ever the last 12 months. The dryness and the heat have been ubiquitous throughout the Southwest. And in fact, it started about, as we heard earlier, about 18 months ago. I call it the COVID drought. It's right when COVID was discovered in the United States is when the Western US got really hot and really dry. And I know that correlation does not mean causation, but maybe the scientists should look and see if maybe there's one other side effect of COVID, a mega drought in the Southwest. Who knows? Next slide. And as a result, we've seen the large reservoirs in the Western US at their record low levels, either today or within the last 30 days. We've already heard about Lake Powell going down to its lowest level ever. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, hit its lowest level. And Lake Oroville, the largest reservoir in the State Water Project, also at its lowest level ever. Lake Oroville is now down below power pool, and for the first time ever, there's no power generation coming from this, from California's 2nd largest reservoir. We've heard that if next year has a 60% runoff or less on the Colorado, Lake Powell might go below power pool next year. So some pretty dire consequences of the reservoirs. What we've seen during this COVID drought is the total storage of these 3 reservoirs has gone down by 10 million acre feet. And I think you could look at it as there is a silver lining. The silver lining is these reservoirs. It shows how valuable they are, that we've gotten through this terrible, terrible drought, and we've relied on 10 million acre feet from these reservoirs to protect the environment, to deliver water to our farms and keep our cities thriving, but we've run out of our buffer and we have to ramp up even more, of course. Next slide. So while Southern California is experiencing this with everyone else, this record drought, so far we have not had to ration water or mandate water conservation in our service area. Northern California is under mandatory conservation, but so far Southern California is not. We've been successful in getting through this COVID drought over the last 18 months. We are under a 15% voluntary conservation that the governor is looking for, and we've echoed that message. But the reason that we are successful up to this point has been three things I want to highlight. One is developing partnerships, not to go it alone. We're not in this alone, we're in this together, and Deanna Ike talked about the partnerships. And for us, particularly important is our partnerships with agriculture. We have a partnership with the Palo Verde Irrigation District and Bard Water District where we pay farmers to temporarily fallow land on a rotational basis. We also have a partnership with Imperial Irrigation District where we fund water conservation activities in IID, and the saved water comes to us here in Southern California. It took a lot of time and effort to develop those partnerships. Coming from LA, generally, for some reason, people don't trust you right off the bat. But over time, working to find common interests, we've developed programs that protect the agricultural community and provide us a reliable water supply in Southern California. Today, about half of the water flowing through the Colorado River Aqueduct is from our agricultural partners transfers, and half is our own contract. The other thing that's been vitally important is investing in storage. 20 years ago, we built Diamond Valley Lake at a cost of $2 billion, paid for completely by our local region here in Southern California, no federal funds. And it doubled the storage in Southern California, which is very important because it's on the west side of the San Andreas Fault, which is always a concern because all of our aqueducts cross the San Andreas Fault, and in a big earthquake that we could lose all of them. But in addition to investing in Diamond Valley Lake, we also have creative ways to store water in Lake Mead. Knowing that Lake Mead's not likely to fill anytime soon, or maybe ever, using that unused space as storage comes as a free way to a free opportunity to take advantage of storage without having to build any new expensive and potentially environmentally damaging projects. And finally, of course, increasing our local resilience and reducing our need for imported supplies. Metropolitan Water District, we don't fund directly these programs, but we provide financial incentives to our member agencies to do things like water recycling. About 10% of our demands here are now through recycle water projects. Cleaning up groundwater has been polluted over the years through perchlorate and other contaminants. And of course, conservation. 6 years ago, we developed the largest turf removal program in the country, spending $400 million to have Southern Californians voluntarily take out their grass and replace it with native or low water using landscape. But while we've been successful to this point, we know we have to do more. We know Lake Mead is projected to continue falling, and earlier today, we heard that while we don't have a great idea of the forecast for next year, so far it's looking like it could be another dry year. Next slide. So the opportunities, as we also enter into this big negotiations that Deanna talked about on the Colorado River for the next 20 or 30 years, we need to figure out new ways to stretch our existing supplies. One is a new water recycling project that we are exploring here in Southern California. It's too large for any one of our member agencies to fund it themselves. So we are taking a new role and potentially funding the largest recycling plant in the nation, which would recycle about 180,000 acre feet. We have expressed partners from Nevada and Arizona that are interested in funding a portion of that plant's cost and getting some of the water from that project. We'll be making a decision on that in the next couple of years. but our wastewater here in Southern California could help Las Vegas or Phoenix in the not too distant future. We
Bill?
hope that the federal government will partnership. 2 minutes?
Yes, thanks.
Perfect. And it's also could be an example because there's more projects. We have millions of acre feet of water going into the Pacific Ocean through either wastewater projects or stormwater, those big storms that we can't catch. If we can develop more of those projects, who knows, we could have partners with someone as far away as Denver that could benefit from opportunities in Southern California. So this first project we'll be deciding in the next 2 years, but it could be much more opportunities for interstate collaboration for new large augmentation projects. Second is figuring out ways and new technology for irrigation to continue but use less water. 5 states are partnering to look at new drip technology that could maybe be used throughout the basin. We also own land in the Palo Verde Irrigation District. We're trying to see if we can change the markets by having lower rent for our tenants if they could grow crops that use less water. Right now, there's not a market for growing, say, vegetables in that region, but is there a way to incentivize and create a economical path for lower water use crops, keeping those local economies going, but recognizing that there's less water available? We have to keep agricultural productive, but we also have to figure out how they can use less water as well. And finally, salt is an issue. The Colorado River is one of the saltier large rivers in the country, and recently the biggest project was shut down at Paradox Valley, which controlled 110,000 tons a year, prevented this hypersaline groundwater from entering the Colorado River. But because of earthquake concerns in the region, that project has been turned off for 2 years. Why does salt matter in a drought? Well, because we in Southern California recycle water, and when you recycle water, it gets saltier. And so if the source water becomes salty enough, we have to lose some of our recycled water opportunities. So we need water that's low enough in TDS so that we can fully recycle it again and reuse it. Additionally, crops salt will build up in the soil for irrigation, places that irrigate, and so then you have to leach out the salts with some extra water. So there's more water use as the salt increases. So we need to see, is there something we can do at Paradox Valley to capture that 110,000 tons again from entering the river, keeping the river less salty so we continue to recycle and use less for irrigation. So that concludes my my talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bill. That was great. All right, I'm going to invite the panelists for this panel to turn their cameras back on to entertain some questions from the audience. And I already have a few. Just want to remind people to, if you have a question, to put it in the questions box. So the first question that I have is coming from Nina Hemphill. The question is for Jesse. Has there been evidence of more mosquito-borne diseases with warmer water or more drying of streams or lakes? I'm thinking more backwaters for mosquitoes to breed. I'm concerned about the northward migration of more southern diseases into areas where they never occurred before.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there has been, we're starting to see more and more of some certain mosquito species moving further northward throughout the United States. And also within that, we know that West Nile has been associated with, which is a mosquito transmitted disease. West Nile has been associated with changes in precipitation patterns and especially changes in drought conditions. And even if you look back to the Zika virus outbreak that happened throughout the South Central America and came all the way up into North America, there's been a couple research studies that have actually shown that that particular outbreak of Zika virus that threatened the United States as well was potentially caused or ignited by a drought event that happened in Brazil and throughout that region. And so there's a number of relationships there, especially when you're talking about drought. And a lot of times when we think of drought, we don't necessarily think of mosquitoes because you think of a wet environment, but it's going back to exactly what you said, that you see more pooling of water, and you also see changes in the behavior of how people are using water as well. And pooling water or stagnant water is prime conditions for a lot of mosquitoes to breed and reproduce. Also, there's been some studies that have shown that hotter and drier conditions actually cause mosquitoes to be thirstier, and so they feed on more people, which is more likely to transmit disease as well. So yeah, that's a great question, and it also is a big concern as well.
Thanks, Jesse. The next question is from Megan Holcomb. This question is for Chris. Is the outdoor recreation industry pursuing ways to better quantify the actual economic impact in dollars we are seeing? I know states are struggling to report the impacts of drought to various economies, and we do need industry leaders to help take on the challenge of quantifying economic shortfalls, burdens between wet and dry seasons.
It's a great question, and to my knowledge, I have not seen an economic study that's trying to quantify the impact of drought and other climate-related impacts on outdoor recreation. The best we have to date would be that Bureau of Economic Analysis outdoor recreation satellite account, which captures on an annual basis the national real gross output of outdoor recreation, as well as jobs, and then does that state by state analysis, but none that I know of that are looking at this climate and recreation connection. It's primarily anecdotal. You know, you're hearing from businesses on Lake Powell or Lake Mead saying that their revenue stream is 20% less than the year prior, and you're sort of piecing those together, but nothing that I've seen at the regional scale.
Great, thanks, Chris. We have a question here from Stephanie Conley. I'm gonna give this question first to Kevin, but invite others to answer because it wasn't identified for a particular panelist. The question is, how much awareness is there in land management that upland forests ecosystems are connected to the agricultural landscapes below? Are there efforts in planning and working with entities to link the management of the two ecosystems and maximize upstream management activities to ensure that downstream users get the most benefit? And I don't know, Kevin, if you want to, I open up this to everybody here on this panel. But I wasn't sure if you wanted to take a stab first at this answer, Kevin. Oops, you're on mute. Maybe I'm the only one who can't hear you.
No, I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear him either. Okay. Shoot. Okay. Well,
I'm unmuted.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
I'm back. I'm back. So really good question. I haven't seen survey data or sophisticated research on that, on the public awareness or the interested public awareness of the connection. I think we probably could learn by adding some survey research connected to projects that are already happening. For example, Denver Water's work on forest to tap and looking at the health of their watershed, part of their watershed, and how that relates to water quantity and quality. What I would say is that in survey research that we've done and partners have done, the level of concern about drought and its impact on daily lives is incredibly high. And while water is complex, and while some of these systems are a little bit opaque for most of us, I know as a non-scientist, I'm learning a lot just one morning here and being challenged. Some of these processes are opaque and difficult to grasp. That said, The interested public is very interested in investments in greater water security and in the resilience of our communities and environment. The level of support for proposals to do that is incredibly high. And I would say, candidly, public officials and elected officials who lean into that are going to gain a benefit if they do it in the right way.
Great. That's a great answer. It's you know, it's often political will for some of these solutions is often lagging, and it's great to hear that probably not in this case. There might be an appetite from the public to see some more innovation and kind of pushing the envelope. Bill, there is a question that came in for you from Dave Wegner, and the question is, what is the most cost-effective new water supply investment for metropolitan water? In other words, what is the cheapest new water?
Well, that cheapest new water is always tough, right? I think the cheapest water is probably we can do more to conserve water. I don't know what the price of conservation is. That's pretty low, but we've already developed most of our cheap supplies. I mean, our region has used significantly less water than they have during the last drought in the 2014-2015. We're 25-30% down from where we were there. So there's not a whole lot more that we can do that's easy. And I think that we're now looking at investing in the more expensive options, right? The regional recycling project is $1,800 an acre foot. There are some desalination. San Diego County has a desalination program that's more than $2,000 an acre foot. So while it would be nice if there were some cheap options, the reality is it's going to be more expensive and more investments to shore up our reliability, especially in our local service area here where our focus is right now. Stormwater capture is another one that there's a potential for some water, but it's not going to be cheap. So I think that the days of cheap water are gone.
Okay, well, on that somber note, we are going to conclude this panel. So again, thank you all very much for your time and for your remarks.